I think we should start with a very basic, though quite big question, and it's how you think about chance, the difference between objective and subjective probabilities. And I don't think that we should just assume that our listeners are familiar with the distinction.
Well, the first thing I would mention is there's an excellent Stanford Encyclopedia article about interpretation of probability by Alan Hayek, another good person to talk to, incidentally. And he, reviews the various views of ways about thinking about probability. And as Ian Hacking, who wrote a great book called Emergence of Probability, says that at the very beginning, probability was a Janus concept, has two faces, one looking to the mind and the other looking to the world. And the way probability got to be thought of over its history was by emphasizing one or the other, and sometimes trying to combine these two aspects. So one is an objective account. There's something about the world that makes probability claims right or wrong. And the other is probability is just about what your degrees of belief or your credence should be in various claims about the world. And of course, these are related. And David Lewis, who thought a lot about this, formulated a principle saying how they should be related that has gotten to be called the principle, main principle about chance. And there's been a large literature in philosophy about the principle, whether it's compatible with his Humean account of chance or not, and if it's not, how it should be modified, and what might justify it, and so on. The subjectivist account of probability is basically based on what a person's degree of belief in a proposition might be, and that was suggested that could be determined by seeing how a person would bet on that proposition. Frank Ramsey actually formulated this really clearly, and later Di Finetti developed a whole theory about it, and Leonard Savage, another statistician, wrote a book about it. And basically the idea is that if we saw what odds people would take in various propositions, we could see what their degree of belief in that proposition would be. So take like the proposition that there's life on another planet within a few light years of the Earth, let's say within 10 light years of the Earth. I have a certain degree of belief in that. What is it? Well, ask me myself, what would I bet? How much would I risk in order to win? How much to win, let's say, $1? Would I risk 50 cents, 70 cents to win $1? If I'd only risk 50 cents, then my degree of belief would be less than a half to win $1, actually a third. The objective account of chance, something about the world, that usually got identified with something like frequencies, how often some event would occur on some kind of experiment or trial. So like probably the coin landing heads of a coin landing heads is the frequency of its landing heads, given that it flipped a certain number of times. But of course, most events and most experiments happen only a finitely many times. And we don't know what experiment should we be talking about? What trial should we be talking about? Sometimes this has been expressed as a hypothetical frequency account in terms of counterfactuals. What is the frequency of the coin landing heads if it were to be flipped many, many, many times? But there are a lot of problems with these accounts, as you could read about in Al Hayek's entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia. David Lewis suggested what I think is a genius idea about how to think about chance connected to his account of laws, but I'm not going to go into a big story about that now because it would take up too much time. But it's connected with his Humean account of laws. And the basic idea is that the fundamental laws assign probabilities based on what probability law fits the world the best. Lewis thought that probabilities apply only dynamically when the fundamental laws are indeterministic. He didn't realize that his very idea could be applied even when the fundamental laws are deterministic. because then you could just end up assigning probabilities over possible initial conditions compatible with the dynamical laws. And this is a great idea and allows probabilities to be assigned to theories that are deterministic, like statistical mechanics in its classical form, or Bohmian mechanics, and various other things. And insofar as I think I've made a contribution to this subject, this is certainly the main one, is that I saw that this was true about Lewis's account of probability and wrote some papers about it. And when I showed Lewis it, he said, "Oh, I see." But then he died shortly after that.
David, do you have anything to add?
I mean, just I think Barry spelled things out pretty eloquently. I assume the reason you brought up this question is to allow us to make the point that the kinds of probabilities we're thinking about when we talk about the Mentaculus are definitely the objective physical kind, the kind that one attempts to analyze in terms of frequencies or in terms of connections between, the structure of the laws, like Barry was talking about, and so on. However one succeeds in analyzing it, those are the kinds of of probabilities that are the focus of what one is talking about in things like the Mentaculus. Okay, it's supposed to be a worldly thing, not an epistemic matter.
Mm-hmm. And right, I agree with you. And I think that we're all pretty familiar with the subjective or epistemic kind of chance in the classical picture. I mean, there's going to be a determinate outcome to a coin toss, but we give any given toss a 50% chance of landing heads or tails because we just don't know but what that outcome will be. But where might objective probabilities or chances come from, if not in this classical picture?
Well, let's see. I'm not sure. Maybe we should back up a little. First of all, what you just said about the coin toss, which is we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it's going to have a determinate outcome. That's true even in a theory whose dynamics is chancy. Okay, it's going to have a determinate outcome. At the end of the day, it's either going to land heads or tails. So it isn't the determinateness of the outcome that distinguishes, say, theories with a chancy dynamics from theories with a non-chancy dynamics. It's a deterministic relation between the way things start out and the outcome that's present in theories with a deterministic dynamics and absent in theories with a chancy dynamics. But our thought was that if you have this sort of Humean, Lewisian picture of laws in your head, okay, if you have this picture of laws in your head where laws are not, metaphysically speaking, worldly things, they're concise, they're certain kinds of summaries that jointly maximize concision and informativeness of the sort of distribution of physical properties over the four dimensions of space-time. If you're thinking of laws that way, then there's no reason why there can't be a genuinely chancy law about initial conditions, okay? Because such a law might well be a part of a maximally concise and informative set of propositions that one puts forward in order to try to summarize this so-called Humean mosaic, okay? This distribution of physical properties over the four-dimensional manifold that is the history of the universe. So the idea is, all you're doing when you talk about dynamically chancy laws is trying to say as concisely as you can and as informatively as you can something about how the history of the world goes. the same thing would be true of a dynamically chancy law. Of a genuinely physically chancy law, but not dynamically chancy law governing initial conditions. That is, people sometimes are puzzled when one talks about an objective chance distribution over possible initial conditions of the universe. People will often say, I don't understand. The universe has only one actual initial condition. What can talk about objective chances of different possible initial conditions possibly mean? In the context of this kind of Humean picture of law that Barry was talking about, it means something like this. I have this story that I like to tell about how to understand a Humean account of laws in general. This story about, you get an appointment with God, you go to his office, you get all dressed up, you go to his office, it's a very big day for you, you're shown into the office, and God says, what would you like to know? And you said, like to know about the world. And God says, great. And God starts reciting the facts of the Humean mosaic. He says there was an elementary particle of such and such a kind at such and such a point at such and such a time, and there was an electric field of such and such an intensity at such and such a point and such a time. And he's reeling off this infinite list of particular facts about the world. This list of particular facts is what I'm referring to when I talk about the Humean mosaic. And you're listening to this recitation of all these particular facts, and it dawns on you pretty quickly that this is not at all what you want, that this is not the kind of thing that you could possibly hold in your head or that would be of any use to you, and besides which, you're supposed to get a haircut later in the afternoon, and so on and so forth, and you need God to speed this up in one way or another. So you say to God, look, it's beginning to dawn on me that this is not what I want. I want something else. God says, what do you want? You asked me to tell you about the world. I'm telling you about the world. You say to God, you're right. I take it back. Here's what I'd like. And for this illustration, Barry's T-shirt is particularly appropriate. You say, here's what I think I'd like. Tell me as much as you can about the world, subject to the constraint that I could print it all on a T-shirt. Okay. And God says, okay, good. That is, tell me something which jointly maximizes concision and informativeness. Tell me all you can, subject to the constraint that the entirety of what you tell me could be printed on a T-shirt. So God says, fine. And God says, and God will, for example, say, here's something that should be on the T-shirt, F equals ma. Here's something else that should be on the T-shirt. I mean, we're talking about a classical world here. Newton's law of gravitation and Coulomb's laws of electrostatic attraction and repulsion and Maxwell's equations of the electromagnetic field. And you say, okay, that's great, but there's a lot that's not telling me. There are ways for the world to behave that are consistent with the laws we've written down so far, with the dynamical laws that we've written down so far, that we know the world doesn't behave, okay? For example, the time reverse, these laws have this property of being time reversal symmetric. These dynamical laws have the mathematical property that for any process which is in accord with those laws, the exact same process going backwards will also be in accord with those laws. But there are all kinds of things that whose backward evolutions never happen. I see stones falling into ponds and circular ripples going outward. I never see circular ripples coming inward on the surface and then a stone being ejected out of the pond. I never see smoke collecting from all corners of a room and going back into a cigarette, so on and so forth. I never see heat spontaneously transferred from a cooler body to a hotter body, so on and so forth. And yet, all of these are solutions to the various equations that we've put on our T-shirt so far, F equals ma together with the force laws and so on. Isn't there something more you can tell me? And God says, well, that would have to be something about initial conditions. I could tell you the initial condition, but that would take up a precise description of the initial position and velocity of every particle in the universe.
Your whole wardrobe.
Right. And that wouldn't fit on the T-shirt, and it wouldn't fit, as Barry says, on a whole wardrobe. So God says, what are we going to do here? God says, I know. I'll tell you something about the initial condition. There's indeed only one initial condition, but here's a simple way to tell you something, although not everything about it. It's one of those initial conditions which is typical with respect to a probability distribution like this, okay? If you go with that, then you won't go around in the world expecting stones to leap out of ponds. You'll assign a very low probability to that. You won't expect smoke to collect from the corners of a room back into a cigarette. You won't expect spontaneous transfers of heat from a cooler body to a hotter body, so on and so forth. So these kinds of probability distributions are exactly like the dynamical laws, F equals ma, so on and so forth. Simple things that I can tell you, appropriate parts of a maximally concise and informative set of propositions about the way the world is, that are concise to the degree that you could fit them on a T-shirt. This is how chances over things like initial conditions, even though there's only one initial condition, might enter into such a description, might find their way onto such a T-shirt. That qualifies them on a Humean view, on a Lewisian view, on a Loewerian view, as probabilistic laws in exactly the same way that dynamically chancy laws are probabilistic laws.
Can I add a few things? Robinson, you may have a question first. Or about,
No, go ahead.
Okay, there are a couple of things. I love David's story and his way of telling it. I would say that, of course, if Hume heard that it's being expounded by his having an interview with God, Hume would turn over in his grave or wherever he happens to be right now. The other thing is that the part of the Humean account that's being used here is not one of the things that comes to people's minds at first, and which David Lewis also is part of his account, which is that there are no necessary connections among events. That's not what's being employed here. The thing that's being employed here is that what laws and what probabilities do is they systematize and summarize, as David was saying. And if you understand that this is what the job of probability is, you could see how probability was introduced by, let's say, people noticed that there were certain sequences of events which look like they kind of have a regularity, but you can't say what will happen next. But you look at sequences of them like coin flips, H, H, T, 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 H, T, H, T, H, T, T, and you realize, or might realize, that we could systematize or summarize that by saying that the probability of individual outcomes is, let's say, a half, and the outcomes are independent of each other. That gives you a lot of information, particularly if the information is extracted via this thing that Lewis called, and I mentioned earlier, the principal, by telling you what your degree of belief should be. And that's what probability is. And for my own part, I got into philosophy because I was a pain in the neck to my physics and my statistics teacher. I also had a history teacher too, asking them, what are you talking about when you're talking about probability all the time? And they said, go to the philosophy department, go to the philosophy department, which I did. And they said, well, we can tell you what to read, but you may have to spend time doing that. And I was personally very satisfied, happy when I ran across Lewis's account. And then I spent a lot of my time sort of developing Lewis's insight beyond what Lewis had to say about it. And there are ways to do it, but it does require a kind of reorientation about metaphysics because it conflicts, as David was saying. People have this idea. Popper, for example, thought if the world is deterministic, there can't be any objective probabilities. But this is a way in which the fundamental dynamical laws might be deterministic, but there are objective probabilities as well. And I think also this is connected to a certain view about time. If people think that the way the universe is such that the laws take the state of the universe and evolves it over time, and time, very differently from space, is doing something. It's passing, going, evolving. There's a growing block or something like that, or a presentist view about time. Then this Lewisian conception about laws and probabilities won't make any sense. So I think it involves rejecting this kind of view. And the interesting thing is, as I'm sure we'll get into in a minute, is the Mentaculus shows that you can actually provide explanations for why it is that time has features that it has, why it is that we can influence the future but not the past, why we, as David was saying, we don't see smoke recollecting into cigarettes. We see it passing cigarettes, but we don't see people smoking very much anymore, at least not tobacco. And so what metaphysicians thought they could explain, and their explanations were horrible, to be frank, that's another podcast, what's wrong with presentism and growing block accounts and so on. But those are not scientific explanations at all. But what they wanted to do could actually be captured within this kind of framework that David and I are talking about. So that's what I wanted to add to what David's very nice way of putting